Oops. Let's fix that. No, not that. Okay. 4:05. Sure, people will be trickling in soon. Hello and welcome. Making sure my microphone works because OBS does weird things sometimes. But hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson podcast. And today our topic is time is weird. And yes, just gonna talk about time in general, I guess. I mean, I just kind of thought like an interesting theme to talk about like how our perception of time and stuff can be like very weird, and how we incorporate our understanding of time in religious understandings of time, how time functions in a philosophical sense, as well, of course, in more entertaining ways, like in fiction, and how the movement of time, as bizarre as it is, can make for some interesting writing mechanics and stuff like that. So that's kind of today's general direction of talk about time. And of course, the funny thing is that like, I always complain about how like, man, there's just never enough time, right? Like I'm always tired during streams, like Friday stream, and this is one of those things that like I just try to keep Friday streams to be like my Bible read stream, and even though I work on Fridays, I still try to keep it up. But if you watch my last video, I'm gonna actually redo part 8 of the Book of Kings read, because I was basically falling asleep during my own stream, which is really bad, on a professional level, right? But I mean, this is a small channel, whatever, right? Like puny, basically. Like I'm only 100 subs, which is like a puny channel. But anyway, and I always complain about like never having enough time to like rest properly, and the only days I'm not resting, I mean, like, you wouldn't see me on YouTube on the days I'm resting, right? So that defeats the whole point of going on stream on a time you're more rested up, because any day that I would be resting, I wouldn't be here anyway, right? So like there's an odd, have I ever, like, maybe I've done an odd Sunday stream. I don't think I actually have. That's usually the day I tend to take off now. And then of course, Saturday is a day I normally tend to kind of, the weekend, if you will, would be the times I take off, and then I try to find times during the weekday to actually stream. But even then, it's one of those things that like, of course, I'm not too ambitious, if you will, about like, getting views and subs and stuff like that, because I just kind of do this on the side. And of course, I like to put, the original idea is just to really like just have a place of community to talk philosophy and talk religion and stuff like that, on YouTube. That's the real point of this channel, really. And so ideally, you guys would be a lot more interactive in the chat. We could just talk more openly about things like philosophy and religion. That's kind of the idea of this channel. That's why Streaming Parson basically exists. But with that said, I'm not someone who cares all that much about like, oh, you know, does this channel get a lot of views and stuff like that. Like ideally, you know, you could always use more views to get your name out there. And of course, if you want, you know, my vision of being able to openly talk about things like that, you know, you obviously need more people to be viewing and be more interactive in order for that to actually happen. But with that said, you know, I'm not overly someone who's concerned about like the analytics on YouTube, because of course, like, you know, I don't even put that much time into this channel in general, right? Like how many hours do I spend a week on this? Like 8 hours tops a week, right? Between like what? 2 streams, which are about like an hour and a half, 2 hours each, and then like 4 more hours into, you know, here's my magic videos. And that's not even every week I spend doing videos like that. So, you know, when I did more game videos, like gaming streams, which I do plan to go back to once 2022 starts, then, you know, I'll obviously put more hours back into the channel. Like in this fall time, I kind of am a lot lighter. Probably, well, I might even start going back to games before that, right? Because we're obviously gonna do stuff before Christmas, and so, you know, I'll be putting more time and more hours into this channel again once December kind of rolls around. Which brings us to the topic at hand. You know, time is weird. Can you believe this? Can you believe this? Like, it's already like we're already in knee deep in the month of November. It's already been a week. It's already been a week since November started, right? Last week I did that whole thing about All Saints Day on the 1st of November. Can you already believe it's been a week, right? Time just goes so fast, you know. And I would normally say something along the lines of like, the older you get, the faster it feels, but it's not actually true. Because of course, you know, the way that time works, and, you know, your TikTok on your clocks, you know, you know, it's the same, right? Time travels in a very unilateral way for the most part. But, you know, one of the interesting things that I'm pretty sure I'm not the only guy who thinks this. I'm not the only guy who came up with this. I remember bringing this up during one of my Bible reads. I can't remember which one it was. But I was talking about how as you get older, your perception of time changes by quite a bit. And that's where you get the, you know, the sayings from older people about how like time just flies by as you get older, even though that's factually not true. But an older person's perception of time is very different from a younger person's, right? And the way that I thought about it was, I'm pretty sure I'm not the first guy to think this. I'm sure there are other smarter people than me who've thought this already. But the way that I view it, and why older people tend to think that time moves faster as you get older, is because we relate how time works with our own life experience. And so it kind of ends up being like, you view how measurements of time in relation to how long you've been alive, and more importantly, how, you know, you put anything that exists within a certain measurement of time in relation to stuff like your knowledge and your memories and stuff like that. And as that happens, then the units of time become a lot less important, but rather the contents within time frames become more important, which is obviously true, right? You don't tend to view your day as like, you know, this many seconds or minutes you spent doing whatever. You know, you don't think of like, when you're watching YouTube, you don't think of, I spent 2 hours on YouTube, right? On a Monday or whatever. You tend to think more of like, when I went on YouTube on Monday, I saw XYZ, right? And so you relate to the experiences regardless of their time, the time frame of which those experiences occurred in. You tend to put more importance on the experience itself as opposed to the time of which the experience takes place. And so, with that said, what we end up doing, and you think of this like, once again, as people who are older say like, oh, time goes faster as you get older, although factually that's not true. You think of something like, to put it in perspective, and there's that word I like to use a lot, so expect to hear it quite a bit today. You know, for perspective, you think of like 1 year, 365 days, you know, or 366 days, whatever, right? And I could whip up a calendar and tell you how many hours that is, how many minutes, how many seconds, right? But 1 year, right? People tend to view something like 1 year within the context of how long they've been alive. So, you know, if I were to say like, how does, you know, what is 1 year? Well, 1 year is 1/33 of my life, right? For the dead giveaway, I'm 33 years old. So 1 year, I look at the time span of 1 year, and instead of thinking of like the amount of days and the amount of hours, how many seconds and minutes I allocate to whatever activities, I tend to associate my life experience within that context. And so once you take those things, you put them in amalgamation with all your other life experiences that you've had in other years. And so the way we view time then is more like fractions of life experiences, if that makes sense, right? The year is more like, or like, let's take this year, 2021 is, you know, 1/33 of my life experiences. And so then, you know, I view 1 year within that context of, well, it's 1/33 of my life. And so you take a fraction of 365 days, multiply that by 33, right? And that's how many days I really think, you know, 1 year is, right? And I mean, once you put like something like that, you know, in fractions, 1/33 is a pretty small number, right? 1/33 is, you know, 0.28, 0.28, something like that, right? It's a pretty small number, right? Of a whole, of the entirety of my life, right? It's 28% of my life. Sorry, 132 is not 28% of my life. It's like 2 point something of my life. Didn't move the zeros properly, right? So it's like 2.8%. It's like 2.8% of my life. It's pretty small, right? So you think of like, see, a younger person, let's say a kid, an 8-year-old kid. Well then, 1 year is very different, right? With an 8-year-old, 1 year is 1/8 of his life. You know, that's 12%, 12.5%, but you get the idea, right? It's basically 12%. 12% is a way bigger number than 2.8, right? And so when an 8-year-old, you know, and that's why you see kids are, well, one reason why you see kids are pretty impatient, right? Because time feels slower to them, right? Because they have a smaller, you know, understanding of time within their human experience. And of course, you know, what does an 8-year-old know about, you know, what the human experience is in their own lives, right? Because children don't possess the mental capacity for that quite yet. So, you know, you think of like 1 year is 1/8 of an 8-year-old's life, but it's 1/33 of mine, right? Even though, you know, metrically, 1 year is exactly the same to an 8-year-old and to, you know, to me. 1 year is exactly the same metrically. But as far as like how we perceive that time and how we relate it to our lives, they're very different things. 1 year is a very different thing for like me as a 33-year-old, and then an 8-year-old. There's very different things. And of course, that number gets way smaller. Excuse me. Gets way smaller when you have someone who's like a senior, right? Someone who's like, let's say 70 years old. Well, 1 year is 1/70th of their life. That's a very small number, right? That's like 0.6 something percent of their life is 1 year, right? Well, it's 1 point something. I'm doing my math wrong. If they're said like 70 years old, it's like 1.3 or whatever, right? Very small number, right? Because 1.3 is a tiny number compared to 2.8%, right? And so the way that we perceive time is very, very different, right? And then that's why you hear, say someone in their senior years, they talk about like, oh, time goes so fast, because they, of course, relate how a regular day goes by in contrast to how they've lived their entire life, right? And all the different things that they've gone through in life. And so time is, it's weird to think of time that way, because we normally don't think of it that way, right? We try to think of it metrically, because of course, that's how time actually works, right? But at the same time, we as people, just doing people things in general, I guess, is that we tend to put that metric system of how time works and relate it to our personal lives, because of course, one, ultimately, as human beings, we like to make it about ourselves, but more importantly, that's the best way we can, make sense of something as abstract as how time itself works, right? It's interesting that time has that paradox, right? That on the one hand, we have a metric measurement of calculating seconds, minutes, right? We've come up with a system for how we calculate time. And of course, time, we then use it as a measurement between moments, right? Time is the measurement between moments. And so that's another reason why we tend to, view it in that self-centered way, right? That you relate anything that occurs within a time frame within your own human experience and your own life experiences, because we tend to use things like the metric systems of time as measurements of distances between moments, right? And so the psyche behind that is, it's the events that actually matter, not the gaps between them. And so that's another reason why, like, time can easily be kind of construed in that sense. So then, what's the significance of time, right? Now that I've kind of just done I've put a groundwork for how we actually do in fact view time. This is an idea that's always been around. We know this on a subconscious level, right? And this is something that happens in any kind of, religious text, narratives, stories, right? And how we perceive how time operates within the narrative realm, right? And so in in the Judeo-Christian context, time, this is where a lot of people get the more basic understanding of time being linear, is from a more Judeo-Christian worldview. And the main reason why this occurs is because in the Judeo-Christian worldview, time behaves linearly, in that there's a beginning and then there's an end, right? And then basically a bunch of stuff happens in between those 2 points, right? of course, one, what the Bible does with this is that time exists, like in a lot of other stories and narratives in general, is that you're hitting all the, you have a particular objective to tell in your story. And so you have to have a place for that narrative to begin and a place for it to end. But of course, where people take the extremes when you read like the Bible, for instance, is that it goes on extremes, right? In that the Bible talks about like where there was the beginning of time, right? And then there will be the end of time, right? And then time won't matter. Time didn't matter before God started time, and then time doesn't matter after God ends, you know, the world with the apocalypse, right? And the second coming, right? And then God ends the concept of time, in a sense, right? And then of course you run into another major problem when you read of like how the Bible treats time, right? Because time exists on a lower tier of existence compared to how God views reality and how God utilizes reality, and time is within a lower tier of existence. Because of course this is where you know Christians talk about like, well, God transcends time. Well, what the hell does that mean if you just say that, you know, as a base statement, right? Well, it's like, okay, what does it mean that God transcends time, right? And so, how one way of looking at it is that, well, time exists on a lower dimension. One, because the Bible suggests that time is a created construct, right? And this is where, like, once again, when I did my Genesis reading, I tried to settle the whole like whether many Christians have debates, not just Christians, Bible scholars, and really people in general who's ever heard of the Bible always bring up this debate. Did God make the universe in 6 actual 24-hour days, or was it like a different time frame? Well, the problem is, and this is where I get where people don't like, one of the gripes people have with like the concept of God is like, well, okay, well, where does God come from? Well, God doesn't exist within the idea of how we have our constructs in this reality, such as time, right? God is not constrained to things like time. God transcends that idea. And so when Christians use that as a blanket or a base statement, well, what the hell does that even mean, right? And so what the Bible tries to do is to say that, well, God exists on some ultimate plane of existence, right? That has always existed, right? And then time is a created construct in a lower tier of reality, aka our universe and the multiverse, if you want to go to that extreme, right? Time exists within that plane of reality, but God exists on a higher plane, the ultimate plane, as I like to call it. And so, since time is a created construct within, in creation, then things that don't exist within that, things like time are irrelevant. And so you can't really say that, like, okay, when did God start to exist? It's kind of a stupid question then at that point, right? Because now you're trying to apply something that exists beyond our reality to exist within our understandings of reality. That doesn't really work, right? And then, of course, then you go back to the whole, the Greek philosophy, unmoved mover thing, right? And eventually you have to, the idea behind that is that, well, you get so far back to a point that you can't really, something must have always existed, right? Which then runs into, ironically, God, the idea of God existing within a time frame creates the paradox of Eastern religions, and why a lot of Eastern worldviews of like the universe always being in existence doesn't work, right? It's kind of ironic that when you use the Judeo-Christian or you try to use the Judeo-Christian understanding of how God has always existed, then you run into the paradox of why Eastern religions and their understanding that the universe has always existed doesn't work. So to backtrack a bit, in going back with God creating the universe and creating time, right? The reason why the Bible treats time as a created thing, and you look at like in the very first statement of the Bible in Genesis, in the beginning, God, da 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 da, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. As you just make the whole first statement, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so basically that statement, the basic level is that like how many people tend to misunderstand that statement is that like he just made two places, heaven and earth, which is not true. That's not exactly how that works. But once again, to be fair, you couldn't explain that statement on a more cosmological level to a bunch of primitive Hebrews. That wouldn't have worked very well, right? But the statement obviously has a larger cosmological element to it, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, then, what that statement is actually saying, at least how modern readers interpret that, is that like, well, in God created time, matter, and space, right? Time, matter, and space, right? Fundamental things that exist in our universe, right? Without any of those things, our universe as we know it would not exist. So, with that said, time is a created construct that has a beginning whenever God made it. And then, as the book of Revelation would say, well, eventually God will put an end to it because it won't, well, not in the sense that time itself would end, but its relevancy would end. And this goes back to, when I was talking about at the beginning of this video about how like we tend to put metric time and then we only use it as a framework of human experience, and then we relate that with our own lives, and then that's why we have the whole like when I was using the fraction thing of like a year equals this fraction of your life, right? In the book of Revelation it talks about how like, well, since God will give us these perfect bodies that are basically immortal, then once you're immortal, well, time doesn't matter, right? Because you live forever. That's the whole idea of immortality, right? And when you're immortal, things like time do not matter. So in the sense, that's the other thing that people misunderstand about the book of Revelation is that like, well, the end of time occurs. It's like, well, the time itself doesn't actually end on a metric level, right? But rather, our perception of time would become irrelevant because when you're immortal, well, time doesn't matter, right? But it's important to keep in mind that time is a finite thing in a sense, right? But of course, God can just keep it going, right? Because God himself is infinite and thus can create time an unlimited amount of times, right? So, which is a weird thing to think, that's a weird statement to say out loud, but you get the idea. But what's more important with that being said is that time has a beginning whenever God made it, right? Whereas in some Eastern religions, they tend to think that time, like the universe has always existed. But the problem with that is how we would then put time in perspective in human life, right? Because if the universe had always existed, that means there would be an infinite amount of events in the past. There would be an infinite amount because if the universe has always been around, then there would be an infinite of things you could go backwards in time. But you couldn't do that, not realistically. And the bigger problem, well, for starters, the Big Bang that, astronomers, we basically know for a fact happened. Well, of course, the misconception is not that it was a bang, but rather there was a singularity, the center of the universe, if you will. And then it began to expand, right? That's what the Big Bang actually was. It's not a bang per se, but you get the idea, right? There was a central point of which the universe, came to be. And then that singularity point expanded and started to grow, and then that's how our universe came to be, basically. Right? on a scientific level. That's how people would explain how the universe came to be on a scientific level. So what that basically tells us that the universe had a beginning, right? So in Eastern worldviews, when they say the universe had always existed, well, that doesn't quite work, because then when you, well, one, how do you say the universe always existed? Well, then what does it have to pertain, right? And what about all the moments with the singularity before the universe began to expand? Well, then does that really constitute the universe being the universe, right? And then once again, what caused it to change? Because once again, if the universe had always been around on an infinite level, then the singularity would have an infinite amount of see, you see the problem here, right? It's like, and it's ironically the same problem that people have with like the idea of God existing, right? Is that like, well, if God has no beginning, right? Then God kind of has that problem. You can't trace back the earliest points of God's existence, right? But that's one of the interesting things about like time itself, right? And once again, it goes back to how you and I view time in relation to our own lives, right? And that tends to be the more important part than it itself as a metric thing, right? Because you think of like, and I was making jokes about this at work. You think of like, okay, an 18-year-old listens to a song from the 90s, right? Well, the 90s is a time before they were alive, right? But it occurred. It obviously happened because the 90s song exists, and but then at the same time, it's like, how does that exist within a person's lifetime frame? And I was making a joke at work yesterday about how we're okay. So for context, and this makes me sound like super. You guys are gonna think I'm really weird when I tell you this story, but I gotta tell it because it's just so good. So on the playlist, not my playlist, I'll tell you that much. It was like someone's playlist in like the workplace. Someone else's playlist, basically. Baby hit me, baby, one more time. By Britney Spears came on. That song came out. I think it was 19. I'm gonna check it. When that song actually came out, but I think it was 1997 or something like that. The song actually came out in 1998. 1998 is a long time ago, right? It's like 23 years. So one of my coworkers is like 18, right? I was making a joke that like, well, Britney Spears was basically your age, but you weren't alive yet, right? Like that's a very weird thing to think about if once you say that out loud, right? It's like, wow, this song was around before I was alive, and the person who made it was my age back then. Even though if I looked at that person now, like Britney Spears was like, well, with that being said, when she's like almost 50, something like that, right? Well, how old would that make Britney Spears? She was like 17 when she made that song. That was 23 years ago, so that makes her like well over 40, right? Okay, so that makes her like 40 something, right? No, that. See, wow, my mental math is bad. Um, yeah, it makes her like over 40, right? Just over 40. She's like 42 now, basically, with the basic math there. That's a weird thing to think, right? So time does exist on a metric level, because once again, some of you guys may know of like stuff that existed before you were alive, and they obviously did exist. I mean, that's the purpose of history, right? Is to take a look at some of those time periods before, you know, times you were alive, right? That's the point of history classes, and to read and understand history. But unfortunately, we also live in a day and age where studying is not, you know, at least from people I talk to, they don't study history as well as they should. And it's embarrassingly bad. And to be fair, I was part of this generation that we didn't read our history as well as we should have. That understanding history was something I had to take as an endeavor when I was older, right? In my 20s. But you think of like a lot of young people today and being into like okay, before I actually continue this, I'm gonna put this forewarning now. You know, we're going into the I'm breaking past the rules of going into like the political realm now, because I know that by bringing this up, it will end up being somewhat political. All right, warning over. So you think of like young people that don't understand like how a lot of people, even my age, even promote the ideas of like socialism, or at the very least anti-capitalism, and usually then they tend to think like a more socialist worldview, even though they themselves would say like, well, I'm not actually a socialist, I just think like capitalism is terrible and we should have a new system. And then they tell you what the system is and it sounds a lot like socialism. So and then as you hear people say this, you know, that they think socialism would be a better system for our country to live by, you go, well, hold on though. And this is where when people try to argue against socialism, they end up failing to convince, you know, the socialists, because they appeal to history, right? But the problem of appealing to history is that history is from a time that is not within your history exists in a time frame that is not within your lifetime frame, if that makes sense, right? Because once again, you know, 1 year is 1/33 of my life. But you think of like the destructions of socialism. That did not occur within that 33 years of my life, right? It doesn't exist within my time frame, if you will, the 33 years I've been around, right? And a lot of other young people that think like, oh, socialism is actually a good thing. It was like, and then other people would try to appeal to history, right? And say, well, look at all the bad things that happen under like socialist regimes, right? But when you appeal to history, the problem is history exists outside of that time frame, right? This is another thing that's problematic. I mentioned this too in my Bible reading streams very often, where like when we talk about, okay, did biblical events happen? And everybody tries to say, well, did this happen? Did that Bible story happen? Whatever. It's like, well, the Bible stories exist outside my time frame, so I cannot give you a straight answer without you trying to say, well, you're just appealing to, you know, what the Bible itself says. You're appealing to authority and history and the authority of history, right? The authority of history. Well, I slurred that part earlier. The authority of history, right? When I say like, well, the Bible is a written document that we've had for, you know, hundreds of years, and the modern Bible's been around for almost 2,000 years, right? With all of its records and all that, right? But even when I give that answer, that's still an appeal to history that exists in a time frame outside of my own life and outside of, well, anyone who's alive today, right? It exists outside of that, right? And so the same thing happens when, you know, people talk about like, well, fighting socialism is a good example, right? And people who argue against it would appeal to history in the same way that when Christians talk about believing in God, they appeal to history. But history exists outside of the human time frame that you and I have, right? Because neither of us, I'm pretty sure, unless, please, someone, if there's someone that's there that's been around for thousands of years, you know, drank the elixir of immortality, like Tsukasa Yuzaki, right, in Tonakawa. Appeal to anime. I know, I'm such a weeb, but like, you know, where's my 1,000-year-old, you know, superhumans in the chat, right? Unless there's one of you around, please, you know, like, reveal yourselves to me. But like, realistically though, you know, none of us have existed, you know, in those time frames, in the historical time frames that we appeal to when we talk about history. See, people are quick, and this is where, once again, you know, it's the weird thing about studying history in general, right? Because studying history, to a sense, is antithetical to how we view time in general, right? As I've explained earlier, we tend to view any time frame within the time frame of your own life, and then everything isn't all the rest. Any other time frames exists within that context, right? And so anything that exists, any time frame that occurs outside of that, we tend to not really care about as much in general, right? And so that's the biggest arm wrestle about studying history in general, right? Because you have to accept that what they say is true, right? And of course, now we run into the new problem, right? Where we have, I don't want to say people, I don't want to say it on a sinister level that people are rewriting history, but when we find out new things through, once again, appeal to history, because we have to look at primary sources from that time. And then new information shows up, right? And of course, that's why carbon dating and stuff like that is so important, right? We have to find if it's authentic, if it's if it's close enough to the time period of when the event actually occurred. But once again, that's still an appeal to history, right? And that appeals to something outside of our human experience, which on the one hand we should always question, right? But if it's true, then there's no problem questioning it. Truth doesn't mind being questioned. Only lies do. But it's very difficult to accept it at face value, something that exists within your life time frame, because once again, your life time frame, you can see it to believe it, right? And that's good enough for most of us. If I see it, I can believe it, right? But history is not like that, right? I mean, sure, we can have artifacts and evidence, but once again, right, since history exists outside of our time frames, then you have to have that leap of faith when trusting any kind of history, right? But at the same time, in order to, look at any kind of event, really, and concepts in the world and stuff like that, we have to view it. There has to be that trust in the historical narrative, which is not easy, right? Hey, Bubo, the Mad Jester, I think that's how you say that. Welcome to the stream. Hi. Today I'm just talking about how time is weird and it as a construct in general and how it plays out in, well, all kinds of things. Philosophy primarily is how I'm taking my approach with analyzing time. And so as I was just wrapping up, Bubo, one of the difficult parts of reading and studying history in general is that history exists outside of the time frame of our personal lives, if that makes sense, right? So I'll use myself as an example, Bubo. And if I assume you're younger than me, then this is only more true for you. So World War II occurred like 80 years ago, ish. Well, I'm only 33, right? 80 and 33 are two very different numbers. That's like double, that's almost like, that's more than double my lifespan, almost triple, right? Anything said about World War II exists far outside of my life experience time frame. And so anything that anyone tells me about it, I have to bend, if you will, my understanding of the world outside of my life experiences in order to accept events that occurred well before I was alive, right? And so that was kind of where we just finished off. And I was making a funny joke about how, like, we were listening to music at my workplace, and with 90s music, it's funny, where like 90s music to me is like, oh, that was stuff I listened to as a kid. Well, some of my coworkers weren't even alive yet, right? And so to say like, oh yeah, when Britney Spears came up with Baby Hit Me One More Time in 1998, it's a weird thing to say like, yeah, this song came out when I was a kid, and when I was a kid was before some of my coworkers are even alive, right? And that can be a little weird, especially when you say it out loud, right? Because, you know, we tend to view events within our own time frames, right? Our own life time frames. Boo. Hi, and yay that someone said it right. Oh, I pronounced it right. Boobo. I'm 22. I mean philosophy. The whole point is thinking, so it makes you feel weird. Well, I mean, on the one, I mean, the thing about weirdness, and I mean, I know the title is like time is weird, but like once again, you know, everything is weird because everything in the universe is weird because we only perceive things to be normal until you actually get to know what it is, right? Once you delve your once you delve thinking power into any topic, then you realize that it is outside of, and you know, time using the time thing is a good example of it, right? When we understand when we study history, right? It goes it goes somewhere outside of your normal life experience frame of reference, right? Anytime you have to poke outside of that, well, you enter the unknown, right? And when you enter the unknown, well, anything that's unknown is by definition, by its definition, also weird, right? But at the same time, we have to go into the unknown to grow as people, right? And that's an important part of life, right? That you have to delve into the unknown in order to grow. Because if you don't, then you become stagnant. You become your inexperience will make you uninteresting, and then that is actually what causes a lot of social, you know, anxieties and stuff like that, right? Is when, let's say, you become very inexperienced at life, and then nobody wants to talk to you because you have nothing to offer, right? It's one of those things, and I hate to talk about one of my buddies behind his back like this sometimes, but this happens to a buddy of mine that I sometimes collab with on YouTube. One of the complaints about him is that he's kind of a boring person to watch on YouTube sometimes, right? He's kind of boring because he the reason why he's boring is because he has nothing interesting to talk about. And the reason why he has nothing interesting to talk about is because he doesn't expand his horizons in his thinking. So he can only talk about so many things, and then you get bored of those things, you know, the 50th time you have to hear it, right? And so when that happened, right, this is why, you know, you expand, growing as a person, you know, going to the unknown and exploring things is important. And this goes, and then, you know, to go back to my time frame reference thing and how we understand time within the framework of our lives, right? As time passes, right, your framework should expand, right? And that's why, once again, you know, the fraction thing also applies here, right? 1 year is 1/33 of my life. 1 year is 1/22 of your life, Buo, right? You tend to put more, you expand your life experience framework, and then more things can enter that. And then that's how things become, you know, you have less unknowns, but of course, you know, the universe is a massive place. So there will always be a lot of unknowns. But the idea is, as long as you're growing, at least you know more, right? And that's another thing of the importance of studying history as well, is that, like, you can learn from things that exist outside of your frame of reference in, you know, the 22 years you've lived, for instance, right? And you can incorporate that to your knowledge and then use that to expand your personality. Time is pretty much something humans made. It's always been there, but we made it. The question is, when did it start? I mean, that is the, you know, that's the $64,000 question, right? And I made the joke, you know, when you read, like, even the Bible doesn't even give you a straight answer, right? Because since in the Bible's explanation of time's creation is like, well, God created it in the middle of the 6-day creation. Well, shit, right? Like, that doesn't really help, because what do you do about the first 3 days of creation, right? Do you how do you constitute those quote unquote days when time itself was not even a real thing yet in the creation story, right? And so that just throws like all kinds of trying to calculate, any time frame in the Bible. Well, you just throw that right out the window, right? Because God himself in the creation story kind of treats it like it's a secondary thing. Like time is not something a big deal. But I mean, to be fair, I mean, the idea of God is that he transcends time, so that wouldn't matter to him anyway, right? So no, that's definitely an interesting thing to think about, and it's one of those things that like you can't get too caught up in it because then you run into all kinds of like, you know, insane philosophical spirals that like have no real answer. Excuse me. So I mean, there's no real point in like thinking when did time begin and whatever. But of course, we have to kind of understand that like time did somewhat begin, and of course, astronomers have calculated roughly when the expansion of the universe supposedly began. So that's a pretty safe starting point to think of when time started, quote unquote, right? But the interesting thing, but once again, the appeal to history is problematic because it goes outside of how you and I perceive time within our own lifespans, right? And so that's a tricky thing. That's a tricky thing. Supposedly not all the books of the Bible are there. If you ever heard of the Council of Nicaea, I think that's how it's spelled. That is how it's spelled. They were responsible for some of the books being taken out. There's that, and not to mention, and I talk about this. I talk about this in my book of Kings reading, which you should definitely check out. In my book of Kings reading, the book of Kings is a good example of like, well, clearly there were more books, but for one reason or another, the theory I went with in the book of Kings study, I know we're sidetracking here for a bit, but the theory I went with is the idea that like, well, after the Babylonian takeover, which we know happened in like the early 500s, which is funny when you say like the early 500s BC, which is like 590 something. The early 500 BCs, well, Jerusalem got burned to the ground, right? So a lot of records were lost, and the Bible even makes reference of like, well, if you want to know about this king, there's the Annals of the Kings. Well, shit, those books aren't around anymore, right? Because they got burned to the ground. So, including Jesus supposedly having a wife. Yeah, there are a lot of other legends, and of course, once again, there's the appeal to history, and I talk about carbon dating a bit too earlier in the video. And so, a lot of those other quote unquote missing gospels were quickly thrown out in the Council of Nicaea because of course, I know some people are going to be like, well, how did the people back then know the methods of carbon dating? But like, basically, how the Council of Nicaea, they took like what records they believed existed as early as like, closest to the time of when the Gospels occurred, right? And that, once again, it's the whole problem of appealing to history and outside of time frames, right? And so to use the reverse, and we can use like the canonicity of the Bible is a good example of this. So, okay, so the four Gospels we do have, they were said to be written roughly 70 AD. The book of John's a little bit later, but they're about 70 AD. Now, the thing about 70 AD, though, is that most of the disciples were still alive. And more than likely, they or a student of theirs wrote, the Gospels, right? So when people say, like, where's the Gospel of Peter? Wasn't Peter one of Jesus' closest friends and whatever? Well, actually, it does exist. It's called the Book of Mark. That's what actually a lot of people don't actually realize, that the Book of Mark is actually the Gospel according to Peter. We know this because if you read the letters of Peter, the First Peter, Second Peter, Third Peter, it's implied that Mark, the same Mark who wrote the Book of Mark, was basically Peter's secretary. And so anything Mark wrote in that may have been something that Peter told him. Because this is where another thing a lot of people misunderstand the Gospel of Mark. and it's a reason why people should study the Gospel of Mark closely like this. It's because Mark wasn't alive when the Gospel of when Jesus was around. So how could Mark possibly have written the book of Mark and know what happened with Jesus when he himself wasn't alive? Well, he got all his information from someone who was, and that person was Peter. And so there's your little interesting fact that a lot of people actually don't know, and don't bother to study, is that the book of Mark should actually be called the book of Peter, because Peter is the one who gave the information. Mark may be the guy who wrote it, but Peter was the guy who gave him all his information. Same when the Ottomans attacked Constantinople. A lot of books were burnt to the ground. I mean, it's not just, there's lots of there's the problem of literacy in general, right? You can think of like the burning of Alexandria in like 100 AD. Same thing, right? Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria was said to be like a wellspring of knowledge, and is a favorite among like fantasy novels of like the place with the magical books and all that, right? The Library of Alexandria burned down, right? And it was supposedly a wellspring of learning in the ancient world, but it was gone. It was just burned, and all that knowledge of history was just lost, right? And this is the problem of appealing to history in general. Now we circle it back to where we started talking about, one of the troubles of appealing to history, right? Because you have to appeal to things that exist outside of your human experience, right? So, you and I as people that live in the 21st century, right? The way that we view the world, the most reliable way is how you live your life and the things you see, the things you hear, right? And so on. And the 22 years of your life is your best frame of reference because, you were there. And so, and this is, this is one of the biggest troubles that we have with how we conceptualize time in general, because then, well, what do you do about all the parts that exist outside of you, right? And of course, on the flip side, that's an important reason for us to always address our own mortality and to be honest with ourselves in life, right? Because, we're only around on this earth for not that long in the grand scope of things, right? Like, the universe is supposedly billions of years old. Well, like 30 years, how long I've been around, is what? A mere blink in the face of like billions of years, right? A mere blink. And so time is important for that reason as well, is to address, to really get a good look at the world outside of ourselves, and to gain the word I love to use, perspective, right? And this is something that, like, you think of really any, like, I'm trying to think of an example without getting too political on the channel, because I try to avoid that. I did one earlier, so I'm going to not do it now. But you think of like, music from an older time, right? And it exists outside of yourself, right? You think of like how here's a weird thought, okay, Boobo, here's a weird thought. Michael Jackson's been dead for almost a decade. Can you believe that? Can you believe that? Michael Jackson has almost been dead for a decade. He's been dead since, let's look up the exact year he died so I don't actually misinform you. Oops. Yeah, the American songwriter. Michael Jackson died he's been dead longer than a decade. He died, okay, so Michael Jackson was born in 1958 and he lived to 2009. So yeah, he's been dead for over a decade, right? I thought we were reaching the decade. I thought he died like just after 2010. I thought he died like 2012 or something like that. But besides the point, Michael Jackson's been dead for over a decade, right? But yet his music is still popular to this day, because I mean, there's a reason why the dude's called the king of rock, or the king of pop. Sorry, not the king of rock. He's called the king of pop for a reason. But if you think about it, like, he exists, if you will, outside of a certain time reference, right? Because, I mean, born in 1958, well, he's older than my parents. By a little bit. He's like a little bit older than my parents. My parents were born just as the 60s were hitting. So, because my parents are hitting the senior years. Yeah, the king of rock is Elvis, my bad, right? The king of pop, right? There's a reason why he's called the king of pop, right? Because the dude's music is sick, right? And it's still popular to this day. I mean, how could you possibly, you know, well, it's not right to say that, like, you can't make better music than him now. But what Michael Jackson did, especially, back in the 80s, it was extremely innovative at the time, right? Yeah, see, you're born in 98. You're born when Baby Hit Me One More Time, was a thing, right? And I made a joke about that song earlier in the podcast. Baby Hit Me One More Time by Britney Spears exists almost outside of your life time frame, right? But yet it's a song that's still listened to this day, right? And someone like me would say, like, oh yeah, I remember that song when it came out, Baby Hit Me One More Time. And, here's another weird thing when you think of, like, time being weird, right? I always throw the example of, like, here's something that's weird. Especially when I say it out loud. You ready for it? Taylor Swift and I are the same age. Think about that. Taylor Swift and I are the same age. I'm just sad. I was born one day in the exact year that Scatman John passed. I mean, yeah, like, you think that's the interesting thing about, like, when you think of other people's life spans within the time frame of your own lifespan, right? And that's the other thing that makes kind of, our perception of time weird, right? When people have lived outside of your own life time frame. And I don't know why I keep doing the rectangle with my hands every time I say the word time frame. But you get what I'm getting at, though, right? Time is weird like that, right? But, of course, when we think of any kind of events, right, we always try to associate it within, our own personal time frames, because that's the best reference we have, right? Because if you think of it like this, here's an example. I used it at the beginning of the video as well. I also use it in, like, my Bible stream videos. I tend to bring this up quite a bit. But to modernize the idea, it's like, okay, you're on YouTube, right? You're watching videos on YouTube. You don't think I spent 3 hours watching YouTube videos today. That's not how you would summarize your YouTube experience today. What you would do is normally is like, well, I saw X video, Y video, and Z video on YouTube, regardless of the time frame. So it's like, okay, instead of I watch YouTube for 3 hours, you might say something like, oh, I watched, I'm trying to think of, like, a big YouTuber. You think, like, I watched, this is how much I don't really watch YouTube, right? I watch, like, rap tunes, okay? Like, okay, so I'll use my example, right? I watch a lot of rap tunes. They're, like, guys who do parodies of video games, and they're hilarious. It's like, yeah, I was watching rap tune videos today. I don't really make mental note of how many hours I spent watching rap tune videos today. I would just think that, like, my YouTube experience on November the 8th of 2021 was watching rap tune videos, right? The time part is irrelevant because, once again, the time frame exists within my human experience, and my human experience is the entertainment value as far as YouTube is concerned, right? And so that's the tricky thing about when we try to think about time in general. Anyway, I've rambled about that part long enough. We're hitting near close, well, it's like 5:10, so this podcast will go for about another 20 minutes. And I did mention in the description, I was going to talk about another thing where time is just weird. And that's how narratives utilize the concept of time travel. Because if time, this is the thing that makes time travel really annoying in writing. Because on the one hand, you can make all kinds of stories involving time travel. I mean, billions of science fiction stories, have utilized time travel. right? But the problem of time travel in general, and we were just having this talk, us just having this talk about like how time as it is right now is already pretty complex and it's very convoluted and all over the place, right? When we look at time like normal. Now you want to add moving, jumping back and forth, moving, you know, outside of its natural constraints. You want to throw that into the mix now? Well, that just makes things way more complicated, right? And of course, that's why like time travel stories end up with all kinds of its problems of like grandfather paradoxes, bootstrap paradoxes, and other paradoxes that you can think of that involve time travel stories, right? Because who doesn't like a good time travel story? But at the same time, they can be really confusing to deal with, and of course, you run into all the paradoxes. And if those of you who want to be writers in the future, you have to really think about these things through. Because I remember watching like this one video, and this guy was talking about like the Dragon Ball time travel story, and like how there was like now we have like 5 timelines or 4 timelines, and maybe a 5th one somewhat to deal with when we talk about like the Dragon Ball timeline, right? Because you get all the different rules of time travel and blah blah blah. Doctor Who has been doing it for ages, yeah. And then once again, you run into all kinds of other weird things in time travel, right? And time travel it's a fun concept in fiction, but it's it has all kinds of problems with it because you just it's just a natural consequence, if you will, when you try to write time travel because time is weird like that, right? Like time is already problematic to conceptualize as it is now and to make things work within time in a linear sense that we have now. And then adding time travel only just like screws that up way more, right? So several things that I love as classics have like this problem, right? When you look back on the story of like a game I love, see, this is me appealing to something that's like older than you, Bubo. It's like Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo. That game is amazing. If you've never played it, I don't encourage emulating normally, but it is one of those games you should emulate because it's just that good. Okay, get your Like I wish the Nintendo Switch, the Super Nintendo had it. The Super Nintendo Classic didn't have it. I'm like, what gives? Chrono Trigger is like one of the best games ever made. But like when Chrono Trigger deals, I mean that whole game is based on time travel. That game ran into all kinds of paradoxes when you look back at the story again. It's like, wait, that doesn't actually work. These other events that occur within the game, they don't make sense. These don't work because time travel doesn't work that way. Blah 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 blah. Right? You look at it as like a modern reader, and you're like, oh, that doesn't make sense either. This doesn't work. That doesn't work. Our evolution of time travel stories also points out glaring problems in older stories of time travel. Chrono Trigger is a good example of like if you want to study stories that if you plan to write stories and you want to utilize time travel, study Chrono Trigger and study how the story of that game is told. Because you'll pick up on all the paradoxes that you run into when you write a time travel story. Emulators are necessary to preserve old games when big companies won't sorry, I'm going to try that again. Emulators are necessary to preserve old games when big companies won't. I literally own a PS2 and Xbox emulator. I try to avoid using emulators, but once again, like Super Nintendo is a big problem example, right? Because in my boomer mind, I know someone's gonna call me out for being a mega boomer on this, but I still believe to this day that the Super Nintendo is basically the best system ever made. Right? The PS2 is pretty good. It's up there, but I think the Super Nintendo is still the best because there are just so many cult classics that were in the Super Nintendo. And the Super Nintendo, of course, the 90s was an interesting change of how people perceived entertainment, right? The late 2000s or late, 2000s, late 2000s being like, zero, whatever, was also a big change as well because like YouTube and stuff, blew up. Facebook blew up and stuff like that back then. when I was graduating high school. But the 90s was a time where there was a big explosion of like how entertainment would be consumed, right? And the Super Nintendo and that's another reason why the Super Nintendo was so successful, I think, was because the influence of how entertainment was changing in the 90s, and the Super Nintendo existed during that time. And so the Super Nintendo got swept into that, and that just made it even more popular than it already was, right? Because of course the Super Nintendo was already pretty big, because the original Nintendo back in the 80s was gaining traction. People were like home video gaming was like a cool concept, but it wasn't easy to do because technology to make it as like it is now didn't exist. But the 90s had, they changed a lot of how we would perceive home gaming, right? And then later, Super Nintendo paved the way, and then of course competitors were like, okay, this is how we can do it. Sony came up with their own thing. Sega was getting more ambitious, and so on. It's sad how companies are against emulation. It's like some games with modding. Well, I think that's one reason when you bring up modding into it, and of course modding is something you can't avoid because we have the technology to do all kinds of mods in any kind of video game now. People are smarter and more efficient with technology, right? In that realm, anyway. I can't just say people are smarter, period, because that's not true. But when it comes to programming and doing stuff like modding, yeah, people have become good at it, and it's easy to do now. And so I understand where game companies want to maintain an authentic, you know, the authentic existence of their past games, right? But once again, there's the flip side to it too, because old guys like me really love the old games, right? Which now I should circle back to, the time travel thing and Chrono Trigger, because that's what we were originally talking about. But like, it's one of those things where like game companies try to preserve the authentic nature of their older games. But at the same time, you have old guys like me who want to be able to keep, like, I wish I could play Chrono Trigger anytime, right? Without an emulator, right? Because that would be great. Chrono Trigger is one of the best games ever made. I think it's more than just my opinion. it's mine and many other people's opinion, which basically makes it fact. Wikiality in a nutshell, guys. Wikiality. Chrono Trigger, one of the best games ever made, right? But going back to talk about Chrono Trigger and time travel, so we can stay on topic as before we end the stream, kind of thing. If you want to know how to incorporate time travel in your stories, look at Chrono Trigger as a good example to learn from now, because back in the 90s, when that game was made, I don't think the writers tried to get around certain things, like Back to the Future ran into problems. The older Doctor Who did. And Chrono Trigger tried to learn from those, but then ran into other problems, right? And then now, as modern readers, we can look at that and then take inspiration from what they learned, all those steps, right? And, once again, we're back to the appeal of history, right? You can learn from history the things that, didn't quite work in the past. Well, you can work around those problems and then create new solutions, right? And that's the beauty of creativity. And you can apply that to like a time travel story, right? I mean, Marvel Comics had an interesting concept of how to utilize time travel stories. And Marvel Comics kind of came up with the idea that like time itself was not so much like a linear thing, like how we perceive time, in the real world. But in Marvel Comics, they perceive time as if it was an entity, and then all timelines, in a sense, exist within this entity. And so the reason why they explained it that way in Marvel was so that like, okay, so a time traveler goes back in time. but his actions don't have immediate consequences, but rather there can be delay times before, like, for example, the one of the paradoxes of, like, the grandfather paradox. So the grandfather paradox, if you don't know what that is, which I'm pretty sure everybody should know what this is at this point, because every time travel story tries their best to avoid the grandfather paradox at the very least. So the grandfather paradox is basically when, as the title implies, it comes up from the philosophical thinking of, okay, let's say you went back in time and you killed your grandfather. Well, then that wouldn't work, because then you would stop existing. But then if you stopped existing, then you couldn't have gone back to kill your grandfather. Therefore, it doesn't work, right? So in Marvel, what they did was they explained that, like, okay, since time is an organism and it's not linear, if you went back in time and, say, killed someone who would be someone else's grandfather in your timeline, or let's say, the famous, like, when people try to be a smartass and say, like, I would go back in time and kick Hitler's dad's balls really hard, right? So he wouldn't be born. There's that whole joke about that. Well, anyway, so in the Marvel comic explanation is that since doing that action would be like cutting, like putting a cut on time as an organism, like treat it as if it's a person. You cut his arm. Well, he's not going to die right away if you cut his arm, right? You have to repeatedly wound him, right, in order for it to actually have serious damage. Because then you run into other, the fate paradoxes, right? And the fate paradox is like, okay, so if Hitler wasn't born, well, someone else would simply just take his place, right? Some other, German would take his place, right? And so in order to really prevent that action from happening, then you would have to do a whole sequence of events to really cripple that possibility. Marvel did the What If episode. If you ever watch Marvel What If, it was like a mini series. I think it only had like 9 episodes. They did like a mini series of, well, as the title of the show implies, it's a what if this happened instead of that. Something in the main story occurred. Well, they did one on Doctor Strange, and the episode was, instead of Doctor Strange losing the use of his hands, like in the normal universe, it was what if he had lost his heart, in the sense that he was dating what's her face in the Doctor Strange movie, and she died in the car accident. And so, in that story, basically, the episode begins with him trying to use the time stone over and over to try and erase her death, but he couldn't. Right? It was meant to be, because of course, if Strange wasn't in the accident, then he would never be Doctor Strange, right? And so what he ends up doing is he tries to acquire power from, like, cosmic beings from other dimensions and stuff like that, so that he could actually change time itself. And of course, what ends up happening, spoilers of the episode, is that basically he destroys his own universe by doing that, right? Because then once he rips out, time that way, then, well, no future events could occur. So therefore, time stops at that event, right, where he saves Christine, or whatever her name is. Time would end there. And so she lives, but then, of course, she dies right after, because the universe collapses on itself, right? And it can no longer exist. And that's one of those, like, time travel stories. Like, Marvel uses an interesting way of writing time travel like that, because the whole, like, time is more of an organism. You would have to rip off its arm, kind of thing, in order to cause real damage, as opposed to, like, you can't just go back and change one event. It's like changing one event is like a paper cut, right? Whatever. Time as a human entity would just patch itself up. Excuse me, and then nothing would really change, right? It's not until you actually kill it, then you would make real change. But at that point, when you kill it, well, then you're screwed anyway. So it's one of those funny things about time travel and time travel stories, right? But time is weird, right? And time travel only makes it weirder, because, I mean, the reason why people like time travel, like using time travel for story writing is because you can kind of just do whatever you want, and you can make all kinds of new rules and stuff like that. But of course, every time you make new rules, you always end up with like dents within, you know, the new rules, and then you have to bend all kinds of other things, and it gets weird, right? But time is weird. It's weird like that. Anyway, I think that's it. It's 5:25, so we're gonna end the stream pretty soon. But before that, we're just gonna do some housekeeping, basic housekeeping this week. Nothing out of the ordinary. Thursday, we have our Throwback Thursday video of Heroes of Might and Magic 2. Trying to remember what episode we're on. It's been a while since I filmed. I'll have to film more this weekend to prep for next week. But I'm pretty sure I have an episode ready for this Thursday. I should have an episode ready for this Thursday. Because I filmed the last set of episodes on like All Saints Day before when I did the All Saints Day stream. So it's been a while since I filmed Heroes 2. And yes, if it isn't obvious, I obviously film, you know, more than one episode. Because one, Heroes of Might and Magic is one of those games you can't just play for 45 minutes, right? I obviously play it for like a couple hours at a time because Heroes is just that good. Even though it's a super old game and I've played it like how many times now, I always come back to it. I just really love that game. But anyway, Heroes of Might and Magic 2 Price of Loyalty on Thursday for Throwback Thursdays. And Friday's stream, I will redo. I'll do like a Book of Kings Part 8 Take 2. Because I'm going to redo it. Because I like that stream, it was embarrassing. Like I was like falling asleep in my own stream. And I was so exhausted that day. I don't know what's up with that. It was just bad that day. So I'm going to redo Part 8. We're going to do it proper, right? We're going to read from chapters 9 to chapter 12. We're going to do it properly. I'm going to hopefully have enough rest, because that's one of the tricky things, right? And, you know, not having enough time for anything. And adding YouTube to the side for that, it just makes it all the more difficult, right? So, but Friday we'll try and do the Bible reading stream justice this Friday. So that's kind of how this week's going to be. So, simple recap. Heroes of Might and Magic 2, Thursday. Upload video. Friday, Bible reading stream, Book of Kings, Part 8, Take 2. And we'll do that at 3 o'clock Pacific time. So hope you guys, you know, come to those things. And with that said, thank you for indulging me on talking about how weird time is. Because time is, in fact, very strange. It's weird. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And I'll see you guys Thursday for Throwback Thursday. Have a good night, and God bless you.